The Mamandur Man-Eater by Kenneth Anderson. Read and recorded by Apratim Viraj Singh. This animal was a female, and young at that, so there was no apparent reason for her becoming a man-killer. But because she began her depredations shortly after the death of the man-eating tiger of the Chamala Valley, whose career I have told in the story entitled The Striped Terror of the Chamala Valley, and operated partly in the same locality, there were perhaps some grounds for the local gossip that set her down as the mate of that august killer. Another, and equally likely explanation was that she was a grown-up cub who had learned the evil practice of man-killing and man-eating from her evil sire. Whatever her antecedents, this tigress made her first attempt at killing a human being when she attacked a herdsman who attempted to succor a fine milch cow, which she had chosen to attack from amongst his herd of cattle and whose neck she had just skillfully broken. The herdsman very bravely but foolishly attempted to frighten the tigress away from the fallen cow by shouting and brandishing his staff in the air. Mostly, such tactics have the desired effect of frightening the tiger away, but in this case, the effect was just the reverse. Instead of bounding away, the tigress bounded towards the herdsman, covering the short 20 yards that separated them at incredible speed. The herdsman turned tail and bolted, but the tigress dealt him a raking blow with her front paw that opened the flesh from shoulder to buttocks. The weight of the blow bore him to the ground, but in this, her first attack on a human being, the tigress apparently considered she had inflicted enough damage, for she turned back to the cow she had just killed. With returning consciousness, the herdsman could hear the crunch of bones a mere 40 yards away, as the tigress fed on the cow. Fortunately, this man kept his head and did not attempt to get to his feet. In all likelihood, any such movement would have provoked a second, and this time, a fatal attack. So he lay, as he had fallen, on his face, but by stealthily moving his head very slowly and slightly, he was able to see the tigress as she fed. He told me afterwards that he would never forget the next hour for the rest of his life. Apparently, the tigress stopped eating every now and then, raised her head, and glanced in his direction. Once she got to her feet and even took a few steps towards him. The poor fellow almost screamed with terror, and nearly made the mistake of moving. Perhaps his very terror saved his life by making him incapable of movement. Fortunately, the tigress then changed her mind and returned to the cow. It was more than an hour, the herdsman told me, before the tigress eventually decided she had eaten enough. She then leisurely sat on her haunches, licked her forepaws thoroughly, and began to clean her face. With a final backward glance at his recumbent figure, she at last got to her feet, stretched herself contentedly, and walked off into the jungle. The herdsman lay still for another 10 minutes to make perfectly sure she had really gone. Then he got to his feet and dashed homewards as fast as he could run. There is at least one other, equally remarkable end to this story. The deep scratches the tigress had inflicted healed completely in spite of the absence of any proper medical treatment, apart from some crushed herbs mixed with cow dung, which a native doctor rubbed into the wounds. Perhaps the shawl he had been wearing, draped across his shoulders, had prevented the poisonous matter under the claws from entering the bloodstream. This incident had occurred scarcely 4 miles from Mamandur railway station, where a rocky escarpment fell sharply for about 300 feet into a forest glen, through which ran a little stream. The next incident was also one of mauling, but this time the victim was not so lucky. Again, it was a cowherd who was involved, an elderly man who died of his wounds. The events were much the same as in the earlier case. The tigress had dashed into a herd of cattle that was grazing a mile to the west of the railway line that cut through the forest, and had once more selected a milch cow for her victim. As the frightened cattle stampeded past the elderly herdsman, he ran in the direction from which they had come to learn the cause of their alarm. Soon he came upon the tigress astride the dead cow. This time no attempt was made to frighten her off. The herdsman just stopped in his tracks in surprise. But evidently the tigress resented his appearance on the scene, for she attacked and mauled him severely. Then she walked back to the dead cow and dragged it away into the undergrowth. It was 3 hours before help came to the old man. The cattle had stampeded across the railway line. The old man's brother, coming in search of him, saw that the cattle had moved and that their owner was nowhere to be seen. Standing on the railway embankment, he called loudly to his brother, but got no response. Then, sensing that something was wrong, he hurried back to Mamandur village for help. The search party, by following the tracks of the stampeding cattle, came upon the mauled man. He was unconscious and almost dead from loss of blood. They carried him to the village and then to the station, intending to put him in the guard's van of a goods train that was due in half an hour, bound for the town of Renigunta, 9 miles away, where there was a hospital. But the old herdsman died before the goods train reached Mamandur. Only at her third killing did this tigress develop man-eating tendencies. She again attacked a herdsman, on this occasion at about 9 in the morning. How it happened was related by a second herdsman who was standing beside the first at the time of the attack. The tigress dashed out amongst the herd as usual and leapt upon a young bull. Somehow she failed in her initial attempt to bring the bull down. On the other hand, the bull, with the tigress on his back, dashed madly to where the 2 herdsmen were standing. One of them, the man who lived to tell the tale, bolted. The other just did nothing, but appeared to be rooted to the spot with surprise. The fleeing man looked back only once, in time to see the tigress leap from the bolting bull onto the terror-stricken herdsman. He saw no more, for the very good reason that he turned away and ran as fast and as far from the spot as he could. When the rescue party turned up some hours later, armed with sticks and matchlocks, the body of the victim was not to be seen, so the party went back for reinforcements. Another 3 hours elapsed before the rescuers, now numbering nearly 100 men, arrived at the scene of the attack. They followed a clear trail and found the corpse, lying on its face in the sandy bed of a narrow nala. A part of the chest and buttocks had been eaten. 3 further human kills followed during the next couple of months. Of these, 1 was a herdsman, 1 a traveler on the Renigunta road, and the 3rd a Lumbani, who had gone out to gather wild honey. Thereafter, all cattle grazing stopped, as did also the collection of wild honey. No more travelers dared to come by road on foot. They came by train instead. Mr. Littlewood, the district forest officer at that time, wrote to me suggesting I might spend a few days at the beautiful forest bungalow at Mamandur and try to bag this tigress. With 15 days privilege leave to my credit, I caught the night mail train from Bangalore, but it was 3:30 p.m. next day before I alighted from a slow passenger train at the little wayside station of Mamandur. The forest bungalow lies a bare 7 furlongs away on the top of a small hillock. The path to the bungalow traverses the small village of Mamandur, where I stopped for some time to make it widely known that I had come especially to shoot the tigress. My object was to get the news to spread from mouth to mouth, so that I would not only pick up all available known details about the animal, but more particularly would be acquainted with the news of any fresh kills that took place, either animal or human. I also negotiated the purchase of 3 buffalo heifers, which I paid for in cash, placing them in the charge of the local shikari, a man by the name of Arokia Swami, whom I had engaged on earlier visits to Mamandur. The bungalow had a wide and well-sheltered veranda. From its hillock, fire lines, or forest lines as they are sometimes called, radiated in 5 directions. Those south and southwestwards ran close to the village and railway embankment respectively. The other 3 struck far into the forest, and the eye could travel along them for many miles. The fire line to the north stretched away towards the escarpment where the very first herdsman had been mauled by the tigress. Those to the east and southeast traveled in almost straight lines into the labyrinth of jungle, like the spokes of some giant wheel. The country in both these directions was flat. In years gone by, when game was far more plentiful, I had spent many a pleasant early morning or late evening standing on the veranda or on the plinth of the bungalow with a pair of powerful binoculars, looking along those forest lines. It was very common to see sambar, spotted deer, and peafowl cross from one side to another. I had seen bear on 3 occasions early in the morning and a tiger crossing the northern fire line at 5 in the evening. Also, although quite 2 miles away, I had witnessed a pack of 11 wild dogs ringing an old bear. I had dashed after them on that occasion to save the bear from the cruel fate that awaited it, arriving just as the 11 demons closed on the harried, exhausted, but brave old beast. 3 of the dogs lay dead before they realized they had to deal with the new foe. A 4th tumbled to the crack of my rifle as the pack began to run away, and a 5th joined the other 4 by the time the remnants of the pack were out of sight in the jungle. I was using my old .405 Winchester rifle in those days, and had emptied my magazine. Only then did I realize I had to face a maddened bear who had been infuriated by the dogs and the pain of the bites he had already received. He was then about 60 yards away, and he charged straight at me, screaming, "Woof, woof!" I ran as fast as I could along the forest line, and as I did so, I opened the underlever action of the .405, rammed home a cartridge in the breech, and closed the lever, which automatically cocked the rifle. Whipping around, I faced the bear, which was scarcely 15 yards distant. In true bear style, when 5 yards away, he rose on his hind legs to deliver the final coup de grace, which is popularly thought to be that most fearsome of caresses, a bear's hug, of which we have all heard so much. Actually, the South Indian sloth bear does not hug his adversary. He rises on his hind legs to tear at his victim's face with his formidable 3-inch-long talons, or to bite him on the head with his powerful teeth. In rising to his hind legs, the bear exposed the broad white V mark that all sloth bears carry on their chests. With the 1 cartridge I had in the rifle, I shot him in the base of the V. He fell forward and lay still just 2 yards away. 3 of the wild dogs had been males, the other 2 were females. The forest department paid me a reward of 10 rupees for each male and 15 rupees for each bitch. As wild dogs are very destructive to deer, their shooting is encouraged. I was sorry to have had to kill old Bruin, but he brought it on himself. All of this had happened very, very long ago. Another factor that made this bungalow very attractive was the sea breeze that blew in from the east shortly after 2 o'clock each afternoon. I think, as the crow flies, the Bay of Bengal is not less than 75 miles from this little bungalow, and I am no authority to argue about the distance at which a sea breeze ceases to be effective. I only know that at almost 2 each afternoon, it turns the veranda of that little bungalow into a delightfully cool spot on which to take a nap. And if you don't believe me, visit Mamandur Forest Bungalow. It was too late that evening to tie out more than one of the 3 buffaloes, which only arrived at 5:30 p.m. This buffalo I took for 2 miles along the northern fire line, where I tied it at the foot of a large and leafy tamarind tree. It was past 7 when I got back, so I kept the other 2 buffaloes in the garage and asked Arokia Swami to sleep in the kitchen. Early next morning we were astir. First, we took the bait which we had tied 2 miles away the previous night, and which was still alive, right up to the foot of the escarpment where the very first attack had taken place. There, we secured it to the roots of a tree in a beautiful glade of rank green grass. We came back to the bungalow and took the second heifer along the fire line stretching to the east, where I tied it at almost the very spot where my encounter with the wild dogs and the bear had taken place. Returning for the second time to the bungalow, we took the third and last heifer across the railway line to the west and tied it near the spot where the elderly herdsman had been killed. It was past midday when I got back to the bungalow for the third time, and blazing hot too. Taking off my sweat-soaked shirt, I ate a belated cold lunch and awaited the advent of the sea breeze, which I knew would start at about 2. Nor was I disappointed, for when it began, it turned that broiling hot veranda to the likeness of the shores of some far distant South Sea island, where we read that the sea breezes forever play. The next 2 days were uninteresting. I visited all 3 baits each day, but none of them had been touched. The evening of the 5th day brought a tragedy. The semaphores along the railway lines of southern India are lit at night by kerosene oil lamps, except in the shunting yards of the larger railway junctions. As you are no doubt aware, every ordinary railway station has 2 sets of signals on each side of it, the near or home signal and a more distant or outer signal, as it is called. Normally, the kerosene oil lamps at these signals are cleaned, trimmed, refilled, and lit by a pointsman or other railway employee appointed for the purpose, who does his job at about 6 each evening. But owing to the presence of the tigress at Mamandur and the fact that the outer signals, both in the direction of Renigunda to the south and Setigunda to the northwest, were surrounded by forest, it had become the custom to light these lamps well before 5, while the sun was still up. That evening, 2 pointsmen had set out on this task at 4 p.m., one walking towards Renigunda and the other in the opposite direction. The second man never came back. Shortly before 6, a body of 7 men came running to the forest bungalow, sent by the station master to tell me what had happened. Hastily grabbing my rifle, torch, and a few other necessities for a night-long vigil, I sent the 7 men back to the station, and Arokia Swami along with them, as he absolutely refused to stay in the bungalow alone that night. Then I hurried up the forest line that led to the west, which I knew met the railway track almost midway between the inner and outer signals. When I reached the railway line, which here ran along an embankment 10 feet high, I looked to my left and saw the inner signal with its red light twinkling. Stupid man, I thought. Instead of attending to the outer light first, while it was still early, and coming back to the inner on his way to the station, he wasted time on the inner light and then went to the outer when it was considerably later. Turning to the right, I walked along the embankment towards the outer semaphore, which came into view when I turned a corner. As I walked, I looked along and about the track for signs of the attack that must have taken place while the pointsman was approaching the outer signal. I found nothing. Then I came to the foot of the outer and looked up. The light was burning. So the man had been attacked on his way back after he had attended to the outer signal and not before. Added to this was the fact that the light of the inner signal was also burning. Perhaps he had not attended to that light first, as I had originally thought. Perhaps he had lit the outer, then the inner, and had been attacked somewhere between the inner signal and the station yard. But was that likely in view of the fact that all the area from the station up to the inner signal, and even a little beyond it, was open, cultivated land? Would any tiger, even if it was a man-eater, walk about thus boldly on absolutely open land in broad daylight? It was possible, but rather unlikely. My watch showed 6:55 p.m., and it was rapidly growing dark as I began to retrace my steps towards the inner signal, keeping now a sharper lookout than ever. An early moon had risen, which was indeed fortunate, or it would have been quite dark by this time. Almost at the spot where I had first come on to the embankment from the forest line was a small culvert, crossing a narrow but deep nala. Something white there caught my eye, fluttering between the sleepers of the railway track as it spanned this nala. I stopped, stooped, and peered between the sleepers. It was the white dhoti or loin cloth worn by the railway man. Wedged under a boulder 20 feet away and clear of the embankment lay an elongated dark shape which I knew to be the body of the victim. Even in that uncertain light, I could tell that the body had been partly devoured in the short time that had elapsed since the kill had taken place. The neck had been bitten through, and the head lay about a yard away. Because the tigress might perhaps be in the vicinity at that moment, or even watching me from the cover of the bushes, it would be unnecessarily dangerous to descend the embankment and make a closer examination of the body. A hasty survey of the position made me decide to lie at right angles across the railway lines and exactly in the middle of the culvert. I would thus be safe from attack from the front or rear. As to do this, the tigress would have to leap a clear 15 feet from the bottom of the nala onto the track. This left her the choice of attacking me along the track, either to my right or left. I should have told you that the span of the culvert was about 20 feet. Not much, but it would at least give me time to see the tigress. Of course, there was the possibility that she would creep up at an angle to the embankment and attack me obliquely, either from in front or worse still from behind, and either to the left or right of me. It was a chance that had to be taken. I had already clamped my torch to the rifle while walking from the bungalow. I placed my haversack beneath my chest to soften contact with the rail. This section of track was broad gauge, which means that the lines were 5 feet 6 inches apart. By spreading my legs widely, I found my soles just touched the other rail and did not overlap it. The teak wood sleeper on which I lay was perhaps 8 inches wide, not over comfortable to lie on and awfully hard. The moon was shining brightly by this time and lit the scene clearly. The corpse and its severed head were clearly visible against the lighter color of the rock and the finely grained white sand of the nala in which it lay. Everything was deathly silent. The red light glimmered from the friendly inner signal. It seemed to remind me that help was close, but yet so distant. The hours ticked by. A somber stag belled from the jungle to the west. Perhaps that call heralded that the tigress was on the move. No, for it was answered by another stag further away to the northeast, and then by another to the east. Periodically, the spotted deer also gave vent to their sharp cries of alarm. But the cries did not come from any one direction. If they had done so, that would have indicated definitely that some carnivore was afoot in that area. They came from all sides, far and near, indicating that several carnivores were on the move. Also, being a brilliant moonlit night, it was possible that packs of wild dogs were on the hunt. These animals chase their prey by day and never on a dark night, but on brilliant moonlit nights, in certain jungles, they occasionally reverse their habit and hunt by moonlight. At midnight, silence reigned again. And then the hair at the back of my neck began to rise. For what I was witnessing was eerie indeed. The severed head had rolled onto its side. All this time it had been staring heavenwards. Now its lifeless eyes and face were turned towards me. Yet no animal had touched it, for it lay in the open, clearly visible in the bright moonlight. I felt myself tremble and grow cold. I licked my dry lips and stared at that terrible head. Again it moved. It had tried to roll back to its former position. It had turned halfway, and then, as if it lacked the strength to complete the move, it had rolled back again and was staring me in the face. Now, I may tell you I am a very practical person, not superstitious, nor afraid of the dark. I had spent many a night in a similar or even more dangerous position. I had sat over half-eaten human bodies before, and on earlier occasions I had imagined that I had seen them move. But never before in my life had I seen a severed human head actually turn around of its own accord, then try to turn back again and fail, and finally to roll back in obvious despair. I almost cried out, and for quite a while was seized with the powerful urge to get up and run towards the twinkling, friendly red light of the inner signal. Then common sense reasserted itself. A dead head, human or otherwise, cannot move of its own accord. Something must have moved it. I stared at the head intently, and the bright moonlight showed me the answer to my problem. 2 black objects could be seen moving in the white sand. They were rhinoceros beetles, large insects more than 1.5 inches long, with great spikes on their noses resembling the horn of a rhinoceros, from which resemblance they had got their name. Generally, they are nocturnal, although one frequently sees them on forest roads early in the morning and again late at evening, busily rolling a ball of cow dung, perhaps thrice their own size, to some unknown destination. These 2 little creatures, by their combined strength, had succeeded in rolling this head over once, but the second time they had not quite succeeded. I had been so absorbed by what I saw that I had forgotten all about the tigress. She could easily have surprised me at that time. It was now 1:40 a.m., and the rail beneath my chest began to tremble. Then I heard a distant rumbling sound which gradually grew louder and nearer. A sharp whistle rent the air, and soon the brilliant headlight of an engine fell full upon me. It was the night mail from Madras to Bombay. Stiffly, I got to my feet, lifted my haversack, walked to the end of the culvert, and then a couple of feet down to the embankment. But I had entirely forgotten to take into account the vigilance of the driver of the train. He had clearly seen me in the bright headlight of the engine, although he had not noticed my rifle. As he was to tell me in a few minutes, he took me for a would-be suicide, deliberately lying on the track in order to be run over, whose courage had failed him at the last moment. I may mention, incidentally, that this method of committing suicide is rather popular in India. Anyhow, with the grinding of brakes and violent hissing of steam, the train drew up just after the engine had passed me. The next thing I heard was the loud thudding of boots on the hard ground as figures ran towards me. It was the driver and his 2 firemen from the engine. They charged up and grabbed me. Only then did they realize that I was obviously not what they had taken me to be. In the meantime, heads popped out of carriage windows, and 100 voices began to question and conjecture. The guard came up from the rear with his bullseye lantern, so I had no alternative but to tell them what I was doing. "Where is the man who has been eaten by the tiger?" asked the driver, a middle-aged Anglo-Indian. I pointed the corpse out to him. "And you have been lying here in the open, by yourself, since evening?" he asked incredulously. When I replied in the affirmative, he said, very simply, "You are quite mad," and tapped his forehead significantly. His 2 firemen and the Indian guard of the train nodded heartily in agreement. A few minutes later, the mail puffed onwards on its long journey to Bombay, and I was left alone once more. But I had little hope of the tigress putting in her appearance after so great a disturbance. At 2:30 a.m., the rails again began to rumble. This time I lay flat on the embankment, hiding my rifle before the engine's headlight betrayed my presence. As a result, the goods train passed me by without stopping. At 4 a.m., again the rails rumbled and trembled, and I hit once more. It was the return mail from Bombay to Madras that thundered by at full speed, as mail trains do not halt at Mamandur. The false dawn came and went. The distant cry of awakening peafowl fell on the air as they cried across the forest valleys to be answered by the cheery, the grey jungle cock. A pale shell pink tinted the sky above the eastern hills that stood sharply outlined now in velvety black. Meanwhile, the moon, which had held sway all night and was now about to set, began losing some of her brilliance. In the east, the shell pink turned marvelously to mauve, then to a deep rose, tinged at its edges by the palest of greens and the purest of blues. The rose became orange-purple, then orange alone, then deep red, and finally flame, as the glowing tip of the sun peeped above the wave-like lines of hilltops to the east. Radiating beams of sunlight cast heavenwards by that rapidly growing orb touched the racing, fleecy clouds in the sky with all the colors of the spectrum. Then suddenly, just as a butterfly bursts forth from its chrysalis, the sun surmounted the hills, driving before her in eddying swirls the wisps of mist from the damp jungle below. It was another day, and to welcome its birth, a glad chorus of song burst from the birds of the forest all around me. Every bush and tree throbbed with life, fresh, clean, and new. Those who have seen the marvel of an Indian jungle sunrise will never forget it. The head still stared up at me, but it was now still. The two rhinoceros beetles that had worked so diligently through the night had long since abandoned the unequal task and gone to rest. I made my way to the station, disappointed, and slowly to tell the station master he could allow the relations of the dead man to remove the remains for cremation, and by 8 I was asleep on the veranda of the bungalow. In the afternoon, the sea breeze lulled me to a deeper slumber. At 4 p.m. I awoke, feeling refreshed and fit, and ate a quick lunch cum tea, while listening to Arokia Swami's report that he, with 4 others, had visited all the baits and had found them to be alive. It certainly looked as if this tigress was not going to kill any of the heifers I had tied out. Then came sunset and bright moonlight. I felt like taking a walk. If I kept to the center of any one of those 5 radiating forest fire lines, I felt I would be safe enough, provided I maintained a sharp watch while I walked. There was also the definite chance of attracting the tigress should our trails cross during the night. I dressed for the occasion. In my own kit, I had only khaki clothes and a black shirt which was useful for night machan work. So I went with Arokia Swami to his hut, where I slipped on a long white shirt, allowing the shirt tails to flutter loosely around my khaki pants. Arokia Swami further completed the disguise by tying a white turban around my head. I did not know what the tigress would take me for if we met, but I know I was a source of considerable amusement to the villagers, who were somewhat shocked to hear of my plan. I debated for a moment which fire line to walk up first, and decided to follow the one leading in the easterly direction. It was 7:30 p.m. when I started to walk. I kept in the center of the line, and as I moved, I allowed my eyes to rove freely around and about the bushes and undergrowth on both sides. Occasionally, I glanced backwards. Although the moonlight was brilliant, the bushes cast long black shadows, and clumps of thorns and grass looked ghostly grey around me. I realized that, for all the moonlight, my eyes could never pick out a lurking carnivore in that unreal sheen, even if it showed itself, which it would not. I should have to rely on my sense of hearing and that other, my 6th sense. At 10-minute intervals, I whistled a bar of some tune or other to advertise my presence to the tigress, but only for half a minute at a time, so as not to impede my own ears that were attuned to catch the slightest sound. Thus, many a subtle rustle did I hear in the grassy hillocks as I passed them. Invariably, the nocturnal bamboo rat was the culprit, as he scampered for cover at my approach. Then an indefinable, prolonged, slithering rustle. That was a snake, probably a Russell's viper, coiling comfortably around and around himself in the grass to be cozy and warm. Something heavy descended from the sky, neatly on the back of a hare as it scampered across the fire line. The hare squealed, and the great horned owl, which had attacked it, pecked it sharply on the forehead. I approached the owl, which extended both its wings to the ground to hide the hair from me, much in the same way as does a hen with chickens. I approached closer, and the owl glowered, drew closer still, and the owl flew away. I picked up the limp hair and rubbed its back briskly. With returning consciousness, it began to kick vigorously. I let it go in the long grass. There were no bison in these jungles, nor elephants, but in their stead bears were plentiful. Nor was it too long before I came upon Bruin, engaged in his favorite pastime of sucking white ants out of their hills. A distant sound, midway between a buzzing and a humming, a queer noise, rather like someone inflating a bagpipe or the sound of angry swarming bees, first told me that a bear was afoot. It grew louder and was punctuated by grunts, coughs, whimpers of impatience, and growls of annoyance. There, to one side of the line and to my right, was a white ant hill. There, standing up against it with its head inside a hole, was a shaggy black shape. It was the bear, blowing, sucking, grumbling, swearing, and complaining as he met with little or no success. Rarely there would be a chuckle of sheer joy as something succulent went down. He was deeply engrossed in his task as I padded silently on my way, and the sounds of his feast receded behind me, growing fainter and fainter. I walked for 2 hours along that line, then turned and retraced my steps. Bruin had gone home by the time I came to the ant hill again, and it was then only half its original height due to his efforts. I saw nothing else till I reached the forest lodge. Next, I turned up the northern fire line and walked towards the escarpment. This line did not run straight like the one that I had just abandoned. Rather, it twisted and turned considerably as I approached the escarpment. A stream intersected it at the 3rd mile, in which a trickle of clear, cold water sparkled like silver in the moonlight. Stooping down, I drank, conveying the water to my mouth in my left palm. My right hand held the rifle with its butt to the ground, while my eyes watched the jungle and my ears strained to catch the slightest sound. There was nothing visible, and the only sound was the gurgle of the water. I went on. The bait I had tied was around the next corner. It was alive, and as I passed it, it looked at me with dumb reproach for the cruel fate to which I had exposed it. I had no answer, no excuse. That I was guilty there was no doubt. I turned my eyes away, but could not rid myself of the sense of guilt. At last, the base of the escarpment was reached. Here the fire line stopped and became a narrow game trail that plunged abruptly into the labyrinth of greenery. It was too dangerous to go any further under such conditions, and I turned back. All I passed on the return journey was a large cobra in the process of swallowing a bamboo rat. 3/4 of the rat were down the cobra's throat, only the hindquarters and tail protruding, when I came upon the scene in the middle of the fire line. The snake saw me and raised its head 2 feet above the ground, simultaneously erecting the fine bones of its neck to form that most beautiful and at the same time most enthralling of sights to a newcomer to India, the well-known cobra's hood. The hind legs and tail of the rat still dangled incongruously from its mouth. Its beady black eyes glittered malevolently in the phosphorescent light. I rapidly stamped my feet and clapped my hands. The cobra became nervous and finally panicked. It vomited the rat, lowered itself to the ground with deflated hood, and slithered away into the bushes to one side of the fire line. Once more I was back at the bungalow. I had covered 20 miles and it was 2:45 a.m. 2 fire lines remained to be tried, but there would only be time to negotiate one, either the fire line running to the southeast, up which I had not yet been since my arrival, or the line to the southwest, crossing the railway embankment where I had sat the previous night over the dead body. For some unaccountable reason, I chose the latter. I reached the railway track, crossed it, and had walked over a mile further towards the west, when, suddenly, the silence was shattered by the moaning call of a tigress. It appeared to come from a point no more than a couple of furlongs in front of me. Perhaps the beast was walking along the same fire line she may have been going away, or perhaps coming towards me. Doubling forward for the next 50 yards, I hid behind the trunk of a large wood apple tree, cocked the rifle, and raised it into position. Then I gave the deep lunged moan of a male tiger. Almost immediately it was answered, from much closer than I thought, perhaps 100 yards away. I did not dare to call again, for fear that I should be recognized for the impostor that I was. Tiger calling should not be indulged in at close quarters, for fear that the real tiger should discover a difference in the timbre of the call. Should he become suspicious, he may just fade away. 100 yards is about the closest range at which such mimicry can be tried. Of course, man-eating propensities and also curiosity, from which most animals suffer to some degree, might still cause the tiger to come forward. But there is always the risk that suspicion may drive him off, so I remained silent and still. 30 seconds later, a tigress strode down the forest line towards me, the moonlight playing upon the magic stripes of her coat. She came abreast of me, then began to pass. I shot her behind the ear. Only her tail twitched as she sank to the ground. She never knew what happened. She had no chance. It was an unsporting shot. Anyhow, at Mamandur, no human has been killed now for some years. The tigress, which was young, was in the best of condition, and there was no reason why she should have become a man-eater. Perhaps, after all, the Chamala man-eater had taught her the bad habit. The end.